John had always been known in the neighborhood as the handyman. During his 40 years as a mechanic, he never knew how to say no to anyone. Even after retiring, he continued to be the one everyone sought out when they needed to fix something, solve problems, or simply vent. His garage was a meeting point where neighbors would show up at any hour, bringing their broken cars or their worries. "Mr. John, can you take a look at my car?" "Mr. John, I need help changing a light bulb." "Mr. John, can you watch my kid today?" The requests were constant, and he always said yes even when his body was begging for rest. It was on a Sunday afternoon, after spending hours helping a neighbor with a car problem, that his daughter Mary found him exhausted, with back pain and an expression of fatigue he couldn't hide. "Dad, you need to learn to say no," she said, concerned. "Just because you're retired doesn't mean you need to be available 24 hours a day." At first, John resisted the idea. "How can I say no? People need me," he argued. But gradually, he began to realize how much that constant availability was affecting his health and well-being. The decisive moment came when his doctor diagnosed high blood pressure and recommended he slow down. It was then that John began his journey of transformation. First, he established specific hours to help others. "I can help, but only on Tuesday and Thursday mornings," he started saying. To his surprise, people understood and respected his boundaries. Then he learned to suggest alternatives. When someone asked for help with their car, he would recommend the young mechanic who had just opened a shop down the street. "Rick is very competent and he needs customers to grow," he would explain. Over time, John discovered that saying no didn't mean being less loved or less important. On the contrary, the more he set boundaries, the more people respected and valued his time. He began dedicating his mornings to his own garden, something he had always wanted to do but never had time for. He planted roses, orchids, and even a small vegetable patch. In the afternoons, he reserved time to read his favorite books or simply sit on the porch watching the street activity. "You know, Mary," he said to his daughter a few months later, "I've discovered that I can be useful in other ways. When someone comes to visit me now, I offer a cup of coffee and share vegetables from my garden. It's a different kind of help, lighter, more enjoyable." John realized that his true usefulness wasn't in doing everything for everyone, but in being present in a balanced and healthy way. His life stories and experiences became his greatest gift to others, shared calmly during quiet conversations on his porch. "Life is funny," he reflected one day while watering his plants. "I spent years thinking I needed to fix everything and everyone to have value. Now I understand that my value is simply in being who I am, with my limitations and my wisdom." And so, at 75, John finally found the freedom to no longer be the neighborhood's handyman, but simply Mr. John, a man who learned that his peace and well-being are just as important as his willingness to help others. It was on a Sunday morning while shaving that John stopped to really observe his reflection in the mirror. The wrinkles around his eyes, deeper now, told stories of thousands of smiles. His hair, completely white, reminded him of the snow he saw for the first time at 60, when he finally fulfilled his dream of traveling to the north with his late wife, Sarah. "Sarah always said I'd look charming with white hair," he mumbled to himself, smiling at the memory. She had passed away 5 years ago, but her words of affection still echoed in his memory. That same morning, his granddaughter Emily, 15, arrived for Sunday lunch. She found her grandfather still contemplative in front of the mirror. "Grandpa, are you okay?" she asked, concerned. "I am. My flower. I was just thinking about how much time has passed. Did you know that each of these wrinkles has a story?" Emily sat on the edge of the bathtub, curious. "Tell me, Grandpa," John pointed to the laugh lines around his eyes. "See these? They're from when you were born. I spent the whole night smiling at the hospital. So happy to be a grandfather for the first time." He showed other marks on his forehead. "And these are from worry, from when your father broke his arm at 12 climbing that oak tree in the backyard. But it was worth it because after the cast came off, I taught him how to climb properly and he never fell again." Emily looked fascinated as her grandfather continued his narrative. "And all this white hair? Does each strand have a story too?" John laughed. "These started appearing when your mother began driving. Every day was a new adventure. But look, now she drives better than I do." Throughout the day, John began to realize how each mark of time on his body told a precious story. He remembered when he was younger and worried about each new white hair that appeared, how he bought dyes and tried to hide the marks of age. What foolishness I used to do, he thought, while showing Emily his old family albums. Each photo here is a treasure. Each moment lived is stored not only in these pages, but also on my face, in my body. At lunchtime, when the whole family was gathered, John served the food with pride. His hands, now with age spots and a slight tremor, still prepared the best chili in the neighborhood, a recipe he had learned from his mother over 60 years ago. "Dad," said Mary, his daughter, "you've been different lately, happier?" John served himself some more rice before answering. "You know, daughter, I'm learning to see the beauty in aging. Each day is a gift. When I was young, I was always running, worried about the future, wanting to do everything at once. Now I have the privilege of being able to sit here with you and savor every moment." In the afternoon, in the garden he had created, John taught Emily how to care for the rose bushes. His wrinkled hands, next to his granddaughter's young and smooth ones, showed the natural contrast of life. "Grandpa, how do you have so much patience with the plants?" "Ah, my flower, it's because I've learned that everything has its time. Roses don't bloom overnight. They need care, love, and patience. Just like life. Each wrinkle of mine is like a flower that took time to bloom, but when it opened, it brought its own beauty." That night, before going to bed, John wrote in his diary, a habit he had recently started. "Today, I understood that aging is not a burden. It's a privilege that many didn't have. Each mark on my face, each white hair on my head, each spot on my hands tells a story of love, of overcoming, of life. They are medals I won not for being the strongest or the fastest, but for having persisted, for having loved, for having fully lived each moment. Sarah, my love," he whispered to his wife's photo on the bedside table, "you were right about the white hair, and about so much more." The next morning, John woke up to the sound of rain hitting his window. As he prepared his coffee, he let a cup fall to the floor. The sound of porcelain breaking echoed through the empty kitchen, and for a moment he stood paralyzed, looking at the shards. "Your hands are not the same anymore, John," he murmured to himself, feeling that familiar frustration. It was the third cup he had broken that month. The tremor in his hands, which doctors said was normal for his age, was becoming more evident. The broken cup belonged to the set that Sarah, his wife, had cherished so much. Perfection. How much time we wasted chasing that, he thought, remembering how Sarah always said that small imperfections were what made things special. That afternoon, his son Peter came to visit him, bringing his grandson Lucas, 8 years old. He found John trying to fix the cup with glue. "Dad, leave that alone. We can buy other cups." "It's not the same, son. Your mother. Is Grandpa sad because he broke Grandma's cup?" Lucas asked, observing attentively. John sighed, putting the pieces down on the table. "You know, Lucas, Grandpa always wanted to do everything just right. When I was young, I worked overtime to be the best mechanic in town. I wanted to be the perfect father, the perfect husband. Your grandmother was always telling me to slow down, to accept that not everything needs to be perfect." Lucas picked up one of the cup shards and examined it curiously. "You know, Grandpa, in school we learned about a Japanese art called kintsugi. They fix broken things with gold, and it ends up even more beautiful than before." John looked at his grandson, surprised by his innocent wisdom. "Is that so?" "Yes. The teacher said that the cracks become part of the object's history, just like your wrinkle stories, Grandpa." Peter smiled, observing the interaction. "Dad, remember when I crashed the car for the first time? You didn't speak to me properly for a week." John laughed, remembering the episode. "That's true, I had just fixed that old Chevy, wanted it to be perfect. But you know what? After that repair we did together, the car actually ran better." Throughout the afternoon, while playing with Lucas in the backyard, John began to notice other imperfections that used to bother him. The gate that squeaked no matter how many times it was oiled, the plants that grew crooked despite all his care, the slightly wobbly wooden bench he had built himself. "Grandpa, tell that story about when you got lost and met Grandma," Lucas asked, sitting on the crooked bench. John smiled, settling beside his grandson. "Ah, that's a good story about how sometimes our mistakes lead us to the right places. It was 1965. I had just bought my first motorcycle, and so the afternoon passed, telling stories about all the times his mistakes had turned into blessings in disguise. The time he messed up a cake recipe and ended up inventing a new one that became a family tradition. The day he was late for a job interview, and ended up getting a better job at the shop next door. At night, after Peter and Lucas had left, John sat in his favorite armchair, the one with the slightly frayed arm that he had never fixed, because Sarah said it was more comfortable that way. He took his diary and wrote, "Today I learned that the perfection I always sought was perhaps the biggest flaw in my life. How many moments did I miss enjoying because I was worried about doing everything right? How many laughs did I miss because I was afraid of looking foolish? Life is like that Japanese art Lucas taught me about. Our cracks, when accepted and embraced, can turn into gold." He looked at the cup shards still on the table and for the first time didn't feel sadness. Instead, he imagined how he could transform those pieces into something new, something that told a different story. "Sarah," he whispered to the portrait on the wall, "you always knew, didn't you? That beauty lies in imperfections, in mistakes, in attempts. It took me 75 years to understand this, but I think I finally learned." That night, John slept with a smile on his face, thinking of all the perfect imperfections that made his life exactly what it was. It was a Thursday when Mary gifted John with a new smartphone. "Dad, this way we can talk more often, and you can see photos of the grandkids in the family group." John looked at the device with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. In the first few weeks, he was amazed by the possibilities. He could see photos of his grandchildren instantly, participate in gardening groups, watch videos about vintage mechanics, his passion that never died. But gradually, that small device began to consume more and more of his time. The notifications were constant. Messages from the family group, news alerts, mostly bad ones, endless videos, chain messages that friends insisted on sending. "Mr. John, did you see that news about the new virus? John, share this prayer with 20 more people. Uncle John, look at this funny video." One morning, while watering his plants, he realized he had spent more time looking at the phone screen than admiring his roses that had finally bloomed. That's when his neighbor, Mrs. Betty, 82, called him from across the fence. "John, I haven't seen you in your porch chair in the afternoon for 3 days. Are you sick?" It was like an awakening. John realized he had traded his quiet afternoons on the porch, observing the street movement and chatting with neighbors, for hours scrolling through the phone screen. "You know, Betty, I think I caught a modern disease," he replied with a sad smile. "All this technology is making me a bit dizzy." That night he couldn't sleep well. He kept tossing and turning in bed, thinking about how his routine had changed. He remembered Sarah, who always said that the best conversations were eye to eye, with time to hear the silences between words. The next morning he made a decision. He took an old shoebox and put the phone inside. "I'll only use it 2 hours a day," he promised himself. 1 hour in the morning to see important family messages, and 1 hour at night to respond to what's necessary. The first day was difficult. His hands automatically searched for the device, but gradually he began to rediscover pleasures he had forgotten. He returned to sitting on the porch every afternoon. He resumed the habit of reading his favorite books. He started writing handwritten letters to his grandchildren, something they found extraordinarily special in times of instant messages. "Grandpa, I loved the letter," Emily said when she visited. "It's so different to receive something you wrote with your own hands." With fewer digital distractions, John realized he could concentrate better on his activities. His garden became even more beautiful. He began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed: the different birdsong in the morning, subtle changes in the weather, the warm smile of passing neighbors. One afternoon, while having coffee with Mrs. Betty on his porch, she commented, "John, you have a different sparkle in your eyes." "It's because I learned that all these technologies are like very strong coffee, Betty. A little does you good, brightens your day. But if you take too much, it takes away your sleep and your peace." In his diary that night he wrote, "Today I understood that being connected doesn't necessarily mean being present. Messages can wait, but life doesn't wait. The scent of my roses can't be smelled through a screen. My grandchildren's hugs can't be replaced by emojis. The warmth of a good conversation with a friend is worth more than 1,000 instant messages." Mary noticed the change in her father and asked if he wasn't liking the phone she had given him. "Daughter, I do like it, but I discovered that it's like that toolbox I have in the garage. I use it when I need to, then I put it away. I don't need to carry all the tools with me all the time, do I?" And so, John found his own rhythm with technology. He didn't reject it completely, but learned to use it wisely. preserving the moments of silence and real connection that made his life richer and more meaningful. It was a Monday when John received the news. The auto shop where he had worked for 40 years would be demolished to make way for a new building. Even though he had been retired for years, that news hit him like a punch to the gut. "But it's Mr. John's shop," protested Rick, the young mechanic who had taken over. "It's a landmark in the neighborhood." John spent the entire week visiting the shop, touching his old tools, remembering every corner of that place that had been his second home. Each wrench had a story. Each oil stain on the floor was a memory. "You know, Rick," he said one afternoon, "I spent so much time being Mr. John from the shop that sometimes I forget who John is without tools in his hands." It was Mary who first noticed her father's melancholy. "You're not okay, Dad. Why don't you try something new?" "New? At my age? And why not? You always wanted to learn to play guitar, remember?" His daughter's suggestion planted a seed. That night, John couldn't sleep, thinking about all the dreams he had set aside while dedicating himself to the shop and family. The next day, he decided to visit the neighborhood community center. To his surprise, he found several acquaintances there, including Mrs. Betty, who was taking painting classes. "John, how wonderful to see you here," she exclaimed, her hands stained with paint. "Have you chosen your activity yet?" He ended up signing up for guitar lessons. At first, his fingers hurt and the notes came out off-key. "My hands are too old for this," he complained to the teacher. "Not at all, Mr. John. Your hands have history, they have strength. They just need to learn a new dance." Gradually, the guitar strings began to make more sense than the tools from the shop. In 3 months, he could already play some simple songs. His afternoons, previously filled with memories of the shop, now had a new sound. Emily, his granddaughter, was delighted to see him play Country Roads for the first time. "Grandpa, you're different. Lighter. It's because I'm learning to be a different Jack, my flower. I'm not just the mechanic, the father, the grandfather anymore. Now I'm a bit of a musician too." The guitar opened other doors. Soon he was participating in a serenade group with other seniors in the neighborhood. He discovered that his experience with mechanics helped him understand the mechanics of music, the gears of chords, the rhythm like a well-tuned engine. One night, during a serenade group meeting at the community center, Jack had an idea. He called Ryan, the young mechanic, and proposed something different. "What if I gave basic mechanics classes here at the community center? Not to train mechanics, but to teach people to better understand their cars." The idea was a success. Soon Jack was dividing his time between the guitar lessons he received and the mechanics lessons he gave. He discovered that teaching was different from doing. It required patience, creativity, and a new kind of satisfaction. In his diary, he wrote, "Today I understood that we don't need to be stuck in the roles life has given us. I can be a mechanic and a musician, a teacher and an eternal learner. Each new role doesn't erase the old ones. It just adds more colors to the canvas of my life." During the last visit to the old garage, before the demolition, Jack brought his guitar. He sat on the bench where he used to rest between repairs and played a song. The old walls seemed to vibrate with the notes. "You see, Sarah," he whispered to the wind coming through the cracks, "it's never too late to be who we've always wanted to be." It was an ordinary day when Jack felt the first strong bout of dizziness. He was in his garden, pruning the rose bushes, when the world spun and he had to lean against the wall. Proud as he always was, he didn't tell anyone. "It's just a passing thing," he told himself, even when the dizzy spells started to become more frequent. It was on a Sunday afternoon during a family lunch that everything changed. As he got up to fetch dessert from the kitchen, Jack staggered and almost fell. Emily rushed to support him. "Dad, what's going on? Are you all right?" "It's nothing, sweetie. Just stood up too fast." But Emily wasn't convinced. After much insistence, Jack admitted that the dizzy spells had been going on for weeks. Peter, his son, immediately scheduled a doctor's appointment. "Mr. Thompson," said Dr. Roberts after the exams, "you have vertigo. It's nothing serious, but it needs treatment. And more importantly, you need help at home for a while." Jack felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "Help? But doctor, I've always managed on my own." "And that's why you're here today," the doctor replied gently. "Sometimes the greatest strength is in knowing how to ask for help." In the following days, Jack resisted the idea. He kept trying to do everything on his own, even when the dizzy spells made him stagger. It was Mrs. Wilson who found him sitting on the ground in the garden one day after a particularly strong bout of dizziness. "Jack, why do you insist on being so stubborn?" she asked, helping him up. "Do you know how many times your children have called me worried?" That night, alone at home, Jack looked at Sarah's portrait. "You always said I was too stubborn, didn't you, my love?" The next day, for the first time in a long time, Jack did something different. He called Emily. "Sweetie, could you come over today? I need help organizing some medications." Emily's voice trembled with emotion on the other line. "Of course, Dad, I'm coming right now." Gradually, Jack began to accept help with other things. He allowed Peter to install support bars in the bathroom. He accepted when Sophia offered to help with the garden on weekends. He started attending a support group for people with vertigo, where he met others going through the same situation. "You know," he said during a group meeting, "I always thought asking for help was a sign of weakness. Now I see it's the opposite. It takes a lot of strength to admit that we need each other." In his serenade group, Jack composed his first song. It was simple, but it talked about learning to receive help, about the beauty of letting others into our lives. When he played it for his family, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. One afternoon, while Sophia was helping him water the plants, she asked, "Grandpa, why did it take you so long to ask for help?" Jack paused, leaning on his new cane, a gift he finally accepted from Peter. "You know, my flower, sometimes we confuse being strong with being stubborn. I thought needing help made me less of a man, less of a father, less of a grandfather. But you know what I discovered? That when I accept help, I get closer to the people I love." In his diary that night, he wrote, "Today I understood that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness but of wisdom. Every hand extended to help me is a reminder of how much I am loved. Every moment of shared vulnerability is a chance to strengthen the bonds that unite us." Sarah always said that no man is an island. How right she was. The vertigo still bothered him sometimes, but now Jack had a support network. His mornings began with a call from Emily asking how he was doing. His afternoons were often brightened by visits from Sophia or Mrs. Wilson, and his nights, once lonely, were now filled with the certainty that help was just a phone call away. "It's funny," he said to Mrs. Wilson during an afternoon coffee. "I needed to get dizzy to see what was in front of me all along, that we don't need to carry life alone."